Welcome to Everything is Changing. In each episode, we focus on circular economy, ecosystem restoration, energy transformation, sustainable mobility, and water resources. I am Ahmetcan Uzlaşık. Perspective is everything, and everything is changing. Welcome back to Everything is Changing. Today, we are diving into a topic that sounds technical, but could have enormous consequences for our climate and societies. The Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, a major ocean current system that helps regulate temperatures in the North Atlantic and beyond. Recently, I read a new report published by the Nordic Council of Ministers titled A Nordic Perspective on AMOC Tipping, Impacts and Strategies for Prevention and Governance. It explores what could happen if the system weakens significantly or even crosses a tipping point, and what that might mean for the Nordic region and the wider world. To unpack this, I'm joined by two excellent guests, Justus Lehtisaari, Head of International Cooperation at Operatio Arktis, and Paul Gunnarsson, Executive Director of the Reykjavik Institute. Welcome to Everything is Changing.
Thank you, Kiitos.
Thank you.
I want to start by asking how is everything going, but let me first tell you how I feel. The world is going through some tough times with many ongoing wars, and I feel like climate issues and what we have been doing gets less and less attention. What do you guys think?
I think on the whole, it's fairly accurate statement, and I think many at least share this perspective. From within my bubble of working on this topic related to the AMOC and tipping points, and more specifically in Iceland, I would say that there, within that, macro trend, there is a rising trend towards climate again. Kind of, I feel like we are moving past this kind of green hushing phase with the risk anchor of the AMOC climate tipping points, and in general with this more emerging climate security connection. So I'm observing a resurgence in political and public attention towards climate issues in Iceland and in communities that I'm engaging with abroad. But overall, it's still, the macro picture. I agree.
Yeah, I can echo many things that Palle said there earlier. I personally doing well, but as you said, this is very true. There are many crises going on at the moment, and I feel like all of these crises are also compounding, and there are more and more things that we also have to handle together at the same time. It's not that because we have a war somewhere that we have to or can ignore AMOC. Of course, people can handle certain amounts of risk at the same time. So it definitely creates a challenge. How many things can we keep in our minds at the same time? But it's very true what Palle said, that especially from the perspective of AMOC, it has really entered this sphere of risk analysis. And I think it's quite interesting, the whole Icelandic decision, for example, to frame AMOC or make it as an issue for national security, because it's a really new and a big frame to frame a issue in climate as a risk to a national security in a similar way than, for example, a country could frame some sort of another kind of a war as a threat to a national security. So I think from this risk perspective, there are also new ways to approach this topic, and AMOC is kind of spearheading this development as well at the moment.
I mean, it does matter. Like, what's happening in the world clearly does matter in terms of government capacity, and especially as the securitization of climate issues is emerging, whereas before perhaps government officials working on climate would be insulated from geopolitical conflict. But as we're trying to bring this more to the attention of the security apparatus in different countries, security situations can take priority and take up all the capacity within governments. So, for example, if you look at the situation that's been unfolding with Greenland, which has taken up much of the attention and capacity within not only the Greenlandic government, but also the Danish government. And there's comparable situations. But overall, I mean, I am experiencing significant momentum, at least, or perceiving significant momentum.
Paul, let's start with the basics. If I say AMOC outside the climate bubble, because we need to explain what AMOC is to our audience. If I say AMOC outside the climate bubble, I believe most people will assume it might be a new car by Volkswagen. But in plain language, please explain us what is the AMOC and why should Nordic policymakers treat it as something very crucial?
So first, as a disclaimer, I'm not a scientist, but I would say that not only Nordic policymakers should treat this seriously as a security issue. The AMOC is one of the bigger Earth systems that regulate climate and weather patterns on the planet. And in the very big picture, it's effectively an ocean current system that connects with other ocean current systems in the world to transport warm ocean or warm water from the southern hemisphere through the Gulf of Mexico into the northern hemisphere, taking a kind of a U-turn around Iceland where the warm water sinks. I hope I'm doing the dynamics here correctly. And cold water is then transported back towards the southern hemisphere. So it's this circulation. And there is now growing evidence that, although while uncertainty is very high, that this circulation may be more likely to collapse or stop than was previously thought. But the big picture is it's a system that brings, warm oceans and therefore warm temperatures north, and regulates by providing cold oceans back to the southern hemisphere. This is important. It's often portrayed in media as the most important thing being temperature, but this is much bigger than that. It's much bigger than the northern hemisphere will get so and so much colder or have so and so much cold winter storms. This is a major climate regulating system. And so when I look at potential risk impacts, my biggest concern is the impact that a disruption in the AMOC would have on precipitation, because precipitation patterns are the fundamental basis of agricultural outputs globally. And while the risk impact field is as of yet very sparse and understudied, the studies that have come out are very alarming, to say the least. So, for example, modeling studies have predicted a 90% loss of arable land in the UK. A recent study from Utrecht modeled that agricultural viability across much of Europe would diminish or disappear. Major wheat, maize growing regions in the world would lose agricultural viability. Again, a sparse research field with a lot of uncertainty, but the results that we have so far indicate that a decline and a collapse in this Earth system would translate into a major global food insecurity. And so it's a big deal.
We will get back to the food insecurity part, but I would like to ask now, from a governance perspective, Justus, what is the real difference between gradual weakening and the tipping point collapse? Because, I was in also Helsinki in your conference, the conference Biopressure Arctis, and also in the report, I always read this term, gradual weakening. What is the real difference between them, and how should that difference change policy thinking?
That's a big one to unpack, let's say, but if you speak about that something is gradually weakening, you assume it's something that happens linearly. So let's say that, you have a climate change that is, worsening linearly, just adding a bit more CO2 and the temperature gets warmer, compared all the way how much you add CO2. But when you have some sort of non-linear climate risks or tipping points or etc., we are speaking about that once we start some sort of a process, it might become abrupt and also self-reinforcing. So let's say that I'm, playing with a chair and then I start to push a chair. At some point, the chair will tip. And even if I stop pushing the chair, but it starts to tip because I have gone over a certain point. So this is something that we speak about nonlinear changes or tipping points. And what makes them really tricky from a governance or climate policy perspective is that once you kind of go over that point, it's really hard to come back. And that's where this concept of what you could call a precautionary principle is really important. So precaution of basically trying to avoid going over that tipping point or starting this nonlinear change in the first place is really important, because if you actually do that, it might be impossible to come back, at least in the human time scale. So I would say, of course, it changes the equation of that. It really adds certain gravity that you really want to avoid certain things from happening. Of course, one aspect that plays into this whole discussion as well of these nonlinear changes or tipping points is, for example, early warnings and what kind of policy signals those might give you of how much, for example, you have time to act before you go on certain tipping point. But of course, there's lots of scientific uncertainty. There's lots of big discussions when it comes to those early warning systems and how they can give you like policy relevant information. Because of course, it's challenging if you say to a policymaker that we might have this ocean current collapsing in this time frame, but we are not really sure, because politics at the moment is really we go in short cycles and short governmental cycles. So I think it's quite challenging to get sometimes policy relevant information, but with tipping points, it's really actually puts emphasis on that you don't really want to mess with those things, because you might trigger something that there's no coming back from.
If I may, just two additional points on this. So I would say it's tricky from a governance standpoint, because this kind of dynamic is, absolutely counter to how human societies effectively react to threats. And I think, many people view the climate issue as once it gets, really bad, we will react. Like then we'll actually do this just very fast and we'll just ban oil and we'll just get it done. And the problem with these tipping points is that point where we start to experience and perceive that it's gone really bad, we may have already crossed the threshold by which time it will no longer be possible to prevent catastrophic changes in Earth systems, because they've become self-reinforcing towards a collapse. And the other thing is, as Justus mentioned, we've got highly uncertain modeling data regarding potential decline and collapse. And so the modeling studies predict that, we might see a tipping point in the AMOC, between 2030, 40 or 2080, 90. And you might think, okay, that's still a lot of time to react, talk about 4-year political cycles. But actually, when you look at the effective window of action, what's required to act on this is enormous in order to reduce likelihood of the AMOC tipping, and will require, decades of effort. And so the governance and policy issue is actually building the required urgency to initiate significant effort on decades-long timescales before a point in time where afterwards, catastrophe will no longer be avertible, but we won't necessarily be seeing the effects. So it really is a very complicated policy issue.
You said catastrophe, and let's talk about real life examples. In the report also, there was this amazing part called storylines, which was indicating some future possible scenarios. I really like that part. We talk about ocean circulation like it's merely about physics and science until it shows up in your heating bill or grocery receipt, let's say. Paul, if AMOC changed significantly, God forbid, what are the first everyday impacts people in Iceland or the Nordics would actually notice?
I mean, now we're into the realm of complete speculation. But I have speculated quite a bit on this, and I'll be happy to speculate more. So I would actually say that the first catastrophic impacts are unlikely to be due to the climate. And I've put this forth, and I've actually presented this, for example, to the deputy central bank director of financial stability here in Iceland, which is that if we assume that the current, scientific trend of pessimism towards the AMOC continues, and the current efforts to build or develop early warning signals or systems continues and is successful, and we are able to develop a system that is able to say, hey, we're getting very close, or we've even passed the point of tipping, and now over the next coming decades, we will see an unfolding of dramatic negative changes. While societies wouldn't just wait for this to unfold, people would start to act. And so, for example, the Icelandic economy, we have our own currency. We are an isolated small economy where a very high percentage of assets owned are held in Iceland, whether it be in real estate or the pension funds, who are mandated by law to invest a majority of their holdings within Iceland. So if I were to predict how this would unfold, I would predict a major capital and asset flight to try and get assets to safety, because people envision Iceland becoming uninhabitable and therefore, uninvestable, and a collapsed economy. And that in and of itself, if it is not prepared for, I would say that the dramatic change in risk perception towards climate catastrophe would generate its own socioeconomic catastrophe before the climate impacts would actually start really unfolding. So that's the scenario localized to Iceland that I worry about. And I've also said regarding internationally, if somebody could guarantee me today that as we cross, Earth system tipping points, such as the AMOC, that the international community would band together and we would collaborate and we would work together to restructure or rebuild a new global food production system where we would help each other out to make up for losses in food security in different sectors in different regions, then I would find this kind of future scenario less of a nightmare fuel. But I think that is at least just as probable as the opposite, which would be a further deterioration of the international order as we're seeing today, further geopolitical conflict, trade wars, perhaps even open wars over resources. And in such a scenario, I don't see the international community being able to react to the catastrophe that will unfold due to the climate change. So in my mind, I don't separate the climate impacts and the socioeconomic scenarios. And I think it's not strategically sound to do so. So that's my take on it.
Yeah. Can I add to the speculation, or do you want to go to another question?
No, please do so.
No, because we did last year, just to add to the speculation, that last year we kind of professionally speculated this issue with the Finnish National Supply Emergency Center, which is this, it's a national center basically who is in charge of different emergency preparedness in Finland. And for example, it played a massive role during the COVID pandemic. So we did this, what we call the science sparring with the National Supply Emergency Center and with the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters. And in that session, there was some things that came out and were put in the report. And what we found out in that session was that, for example, the infrastructure in the Nordics, especially, in this case in Finland, that the infrastructure that is now built, for example, roads, like seafaring, electricity, that the infrastructure won't necessarily or likely hold these extreme winter temperatures that might come more likely.
Heating infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly. Might become more plausible after possible AMOC collapse. The other ones that was mentioned is, of course, farming industry, all land-based activities, forestry in Finland, for example, farming. If the winters get drier, colder, that might affect that quite a lot. And of course, energy consumption would likely raise if you need, for example, more heating and stuff. And I think this actually raises quite interesting question of what does it mean from point of view of, for example, renewable energy use? Like what happens to solar? What happens to water hydro, exactly. What happens to those if
This is a big question that I think really needs risk impact studies. And I've, spoken with people at the Icelandic National Energy Company. I mean, we have most of our electricity comes from hydropower. It's even though it's not clear how precipitation will change with declining AMOC, it's pretty clear that it will change. And so electricity generation infrastructure is relying on modeling studies which assume this linearly changing, linearly warming climate scenario. This may not hold at all in a scenario of a significantly weakened AMOC.
Yeah, just to finish off this, but I think to kind of check the outcomes on this, where that there is like in the case of AMOC collapse and in the case of those impacts, there is a call for prioritization in a way, because it's quite impossible to have everything that we already have, because the situation would be so dire. So you would have to prioritize that what you keep, and it would not be adapting to a new situation in the normal way of adapting. It would be a transformative adaptation. You would have to change with the situation, and I would adapt to that as well. But at the same time, when you think about these different scenarios, have to accept this radical uncertainty, and also you need to be able to invest in highly unknown future as well.
Justus, one part that broke my brain while I was reading that report, or anything that I have read about on AMOC so far, global warming, right? Yeah, we have been talking about global warming for decades, but also now you guys are saying we could have possibly colder winters. How could AMOC weakening lead to regional cooling or harsher winters in the North Atlantic? And I just don't understand it.
It's a bit of brain breaking, and I'm wondering sometimes what would be like the political implications of this, because this is you're just adding fuel to the fire of climate skeptics by saying, well, 10 years before you were saying that the climate is getting hotter, now you say climate is getting colder. But I think Paul quite well explained what AMOC essentially is, and what is essentially, it's a massive conveyor belt transferring heat and nutrients in the North Atlantic region as well. So what would happen if AMOC significantly slowed down or even collapsed would be that actually the it would not cause some sort of a global cooling event. But what would happen is that the heat would actually get stuck in the south, and you would possibly, in that case, have a regional cooling effect, because the heat would not get transported in a way. Like if you think about it, if you have, for example, bad circulation in your body, you might have, cold feet, but it doesn't mean that your whole body is getting colder. So I like to think it from this way. But in these regional cooling scenarios, what actually matters quite a lot is the baseline climate warming scenario in the background, and where the AMOC tipping might actually occur. Would it occur in higher temperatures or in lower temperatures? Because it's not that we have this like stable climate and then AMOC would suddenly collapse and change things. We would still have global warming, and the climate would actually still be getting warmer as well. So there's many variables in this equation, and I think it makes it quite complicated and uncertain to some extent as well.
Yeah, and while we talk about these climate issues, Paul, it's always important to have empathy, because this episode and the report was mainly focused on the Nordic countries. But let's discuss how it will affect the rest of Europe, for example. I'm talking about south of Europe, east of Europe. Let's say, why would anyone living in Athens, eating fish and drinking beer for less than 2 euros and enjoying the sun and good weather should care about this? In fact, I'm just provoking you, but they could use some cold weather once in a while if there will be harsher winters. So how would they make empathy in that sense?
I completely misunderstood the premise of the question. I thought you were going to say or talk about how we should portray empathy for them. I mean, my answer to this is, as we all know, I was speaking, the most alarming risk impact scenarios that I perceive is not related to temperature. It's related to decline in global food production and potentially global food trade. And this is not isolated to the AMOC. If we look at the recently published UK, climate security report by their intelligence community, their food security outlook is very bleak. They determine that seven of the key ecosystems relating to food security are all on a trajectory towards collapse. They foresee a very plausible scenario of local food insecurity in the UK, and they foresee a scramble internationally to secure food supplies for between nations. So a competition between nations to secure food for their people. I think we don't really have to speculate. I think we all know that in a world where international collaboration breaks down in the face of such a food insecurity development, people in the developed world, poorer countries, less powerful countries, they are going to be starving first. I think that's not a controversial thing to say. And so this is not a Nordic issue. This is absolutely a global issue. And the most vulnerable people in the world will continue to be most vulnerable and will continue to be the first to pay the price. And in such a catastrophic scenario, pay the price with their lives. So why should they care? They've got many urgent issues in their day-to-day lives, but this certainly is an issue as well for them.
Yeah, and what you said is very important. And to actually accomplish that, we need a good international climate diplomacy, which we don't have today. And every year it's even going worse and worse. The COPs are becoming a huge, I don't know if I can say it or not, but a huge freak show. And this year is going to be in Turkey, which I don't expect anything. So yeah, the situation is not very well. I have so many questions still, but let me, for example, I was going to ask sea level, but we're already almost at 35 minutes. So Justus, let me ask about the monitoring. If AMOC were a volcano or an earthquake, we would fund monitoring without hesitation. With the ocean, it somehow feels more optional. What would a serious AMOC early warning system look like in practice? And who should fund it? Who should coordinate it so that it doesn't collapse politically before the circulation does?
Huge question.
There's quite many dimensions to these questions, and I'm happy to give an answer but Paul will be happy to continue from that one as well. But I would like to start that there is actually already initiatives to build this early warning system relating to AMOC, not especially on AMOC, but to subpolar gyre, that is another ocean current system in the same region, under the Greenlandic ice sheet. And in many modeling studies, the SPG, subpolar gyre, and the Greenlandic ice sheet are connected. And the UK's Advanced Research and Investment Agency, ARIA, has actually last year put quite a lot of money to a research program trying to build this early warning system. If I remember correctly, it's around £80 million that they have put money on a research program on trying to come up with the early warning system. But what early warning system would be quite importantly is to have also coordinated monitoring capabilities. And we have had continuous direct measurements of AMOC only since 2004. And that's not a long time. And especially there are some monitoring projects going on, but especially from a European perspective, those could be way more coordinated as well. And I think this is one of the key messages from the report from the Nordic Council of Ministers, is that actually we need to invest also in the coordinated way into these early warning systems. It's not enough that we have singular universities or researchers somewhere in Europe doing some sort of AMOC monitoring, but this should be conducted in a coordinated manner, and also in a manner that if you manage to build a early warning system, and if you manage to get an early warning signal, that it actually produces policy relevant information that is then acted on. And I think the European perspective here is super important, because as said, collapse of AMOC would be a global thing, of course, but it would hit especially harsh northwestern parts of Europe. And I think the United States has been a big player or providing also climate related observational data. But as we know, the politics in the United States are a bit complicated when it comes to the climate at the moment. And you can't always be so sure if you are still going to get that data or if they are still going to produce that data. So what would be really important as well from the point of view of AMOC is to kind of get your measurements and the data sovereignty back in the European hands, because it would affect drastically Europe. And here we also need to have the policy relevant information on this.
Paul, would you like to add something?
Yes, I mean, this is something that Justus and I have been thinking about and working on quite a bit in the recent weeks. And the Nordic Council of Ministers report, for example, identifies the ongoing process now with the Ocean Act at the European Commission as a very, good opportunity towards an institutionalization for some sort of early warning platform. Now, effectively, what we're talking about there is twofold. Nobody really knows what an early warning system will look like, but the first half, I say, is rather clear, which is simply a better, ocean Earth monitoring regime. So just better measurements, better understanding of what's happening in the physical world. And currently, seems to be emerging as the biggest barrier towards progress there, when I speak, for example, with Nordic or scientists from Nordic Met offices who have been, involved and responsible for AMOC projects, is that the funding regime that they are operating on is, competitive soft funding grants. So where they apply for funding for a few years. And this is not really suitable to deploy and operationalize an early warning system. That kind of system will require a hard, continuous, predictable budgeting comparable to, how nations budget for, as you mentioned, earthquake monitoring or early warning. And I see a few different pathways towards that happening within the EU. There is the recently announced Ocean Eye project, a new, 50 million euro fund specifically to operationalize ocean monitoring research. Although it doesn't specifically mention the AMOC, I think there is a great opportunity in introducing kind of this early warning scope within that process. But effectively, as we see Copernicus undergo an institutional development towards an international organization, I think I'm using the phrases right, next year. So either there's a model of this where the EU steps up, changes the scope of its existing projects and institutions towards a platform that is able to operationalize and fund kind of early warning systems, or they create an institutional platform where national governments can make commitments to participate in the development, deployment, and operationalization of an early warning system in a way that they have capacity to do. And that international commitment would then, be leveraged by national parliaments to create a predictable budgetary item that would allow the scientific community to start working towards an operationalized system. So that's, the physical science side and the institutional development required for that. But then you have what Justus mentioned, policy relevant signals. What is a policy relevant signal? So let's say, for example, that this subpolar gyre early warning system development that Justus mentioned is wildly successful. The modeling for a potential collapse of the subpolar gyre, which is a critical subsystem of the AMOC, is much sooner in time than for the AMOC. And in all the modeling studies where the AMOC collapses, the AMOC collapse is preceded by a subpolar gyre collapse. So actually, there may be a feasible world where, in one election cycle's time, we will receive a credible early warning signal of an imminent collapse of the subpolar gyre, or let's say a collapse within 10 years. The profound implications of that combined, for a politician to make a decision on how to do something, it's not sufficient to know the risk. There also has to be, okay, what do we do about it for the signal to be policy actionable or policy relevant? And that side of the early warning system, this kind of action connected to the risk signal, this is very unexplored territory, and very few people working on this. And that's something that absolutely needs to get developed further.
We should be definitely talking more on AMOC as you just indicated. It's not a problem for the future, but yeah, I mean, we definitely need to act at this very moment. Paul, like my final two questions, but I need, if possible, short answers. So for you, Paul, you already mentioned it a bit, but just for people to understand this situation better. As you know, climate impacts aren't just physical. They literally reshape communities. So they affect social systems as well. What social systems would you watch most closely in an AMOC disruption scenario? I could think of employment. You already mentioned the economy of Iceland a bit. Migration patterns, mental health, regional or economic inequality. What would you watch most closely?
Food security, in my mind, is the big one, really. I mean, the impact, potential impact on agriculture, fisheries, I mean, it's so uncertain, but so potentially devastating. I would quite frankly, today, like to see fast-tracked a move away from agricultural production of food towards something like nuclear-powered protein production from bacteria or fungi or algae, something that is effectively modular in the sense that, and insulated from, climate developments, in the sense that you have an energy production tied to food production that doesn't rely on any certain climatic conditions. And quite frankly, there's a very obscure United States emergency plan to nuclear war from the 1960s or something. This was the idea, like, how do we maintain food security in a world where, in a post-nuclear war world, where we're not going to be able to, basically all infrastructure, transmissions will be out and agriculture will be out. This is the idea of having these like modular, self-energy sufficient food production hubs distributed, that are able to make sure that people in their local community won't starve. That's everything else is secondary to me. But the problem, of course, is that if we don't, make a sorry, this is a long answer. If we don't start making this change now, and we try to do it after the serious signals, then we might actually find that, capital markets and financial collapse due to climate risk exposure may prevent us from being able to do much at all.
You said food security, which affects, of course, migration, mental health, economy, employment, everything. And that's the most important thing. You said we need to take action. Let me ask, that's what should we do to Justus? You already explained it a bit, but as a final question and as a call to action, let's say, let's hypothetically think that you have a magic stamp and could make one decision happen within 12 months. No bureaucracy, no delays, no committees, nothing. It's just your magic stamp. What is the single most important action Nordic governments should take right now to reduce the AMOC tipping risk?
Oh, so you're asking me to basically be a dictator for the Nordics and make a one decision. But yeah, okay. I would like to unpack this a bit.
You may want to go off the record for this answer, Justus.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. No, no, but to be honest, I think it depends. Do we want to reduce the risk of AMOC collapsing, or in general also be better prepared in the AMOC collapsing? Because I think, I don't think I'm going to answer your question at all, but I think this is still really important to say and state on the record that I think humanity has quite a bad track record of handling any sort of risks. And recently I read an article in The Guardian about the war in Ukraine and how basically the CIA and MI6 had for a long time sufficient information that Russia might attack actually Ukraine, but it took ages for many European governments to admit, even the Ukrainian government, to admit that the risk exists. also from the point of view of economy. And then it happened, right? Russia attacked Ukraine, and all the European governments that were kind of saying that this would be crazy, it can't happen, had to admit that this had now happened. And in this article, it was a long read from The Guardian, and many intelligence service, many national security service around Europe the biggest lesson from the war in Ukraine had been that you have to prepare for the scenarios that were seen not possible to happen. And you have to accept that things that don't seem likely might actually happen. And I think this is straight analogy when it comes to climate tipping points and AMOC. You have to be prepared for things that are uncertain. And uncertainty doesn't mean that something is not likely to happen. And I think this gets translated very wrong many times. You have to be prepared for things that seem unlikely but are possible. And I think we have now entered this phase of climate change that we have such massive risks in the pipeline. Not to say that some of those things are likely to happen, but it's possible that they can happen. But because they are such a big risks, they are, at least in my opinion, from outside from the realm of acceptable futures. So I think what we really need to step up our game in the Nordic governments is to actually be able to draft different future scenarios under this radical uncertainty and accept it as well. And not to get hindered and not to take any actions because we are not sure if something is going to take place. So I would say that this would be one of the most effective ways to move forward, is to accept radical uncertainty and draft different response scenarios.
Yeah, you're a true Nordic, Justus. You didn't use the magic stamp for any kind of corruption or anything, but you actually use that to reduce the climate risk. Well, thank you both for joining. This time, I was too focused on pronouncing Paul's name right. I accidentally pronounced your surname wrong, Justus. Justus Lehtisaari and Paul Gunnarsson, thank you for joining Everything is Changing.
Thank you.